Have you been looking to play a deck that's simple yet powerful and resilient? Do you love playing a big mana deck where nearly every spell you cast is a bomb? Does the idea of taking those big spells and copying them multiple times bring a smile to your face? Then I think it's time you join the swarm with Magus Lucea Kane. Let's start by discussing what Lucea does. Magus Lucea Kane is a 4-mana 1/1 who says, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Also, tap to add 2 colorless. When you next cast a spell with X in its mana cost or activate an ability with X in its activation cost this turn, copy that spell or ability. You may choose new targets for the copy. So to start with, Lucea wants us to cast spells or activate abilities with X in their cost because for each time she taps, she's going to copy that spell or ability that many times. So cards with X in their cost are going to be the bread and butter of our deck. But because she creates a delayed trigger each time she gets tapped, we want ways to untap her so we can copy our spells and abilities multiple times. Therefore, we want to run cards that untap her, preferably at a low mana cost so we can get this ability going as quickly as possible. In addition, because some of these X spells will be attached to big bodies and our commander also has a tap ability, we want to include haste enablers so we don't have to constantly worry about building a big board and then having it wiped before our next turn. Finally, because Lucea does put a +1/+1 counter on a creature each combat, we want to keep our eyes out for any cards that become powerful as soon as they just get 1 or 2 +1/+1 counters. So that's our overall game plan and direction. Now this is where I'd normally discuss the cards that make up the major win cons for the deck. But the thing is, a lot of our card advantage, mana acceleration and interaction cards can actually act as semi-win cons if X is big enough and Lucea has tapped enough times. So instead, let's move on and start with our utility cards. By discussing these first, we're going to get an idea of how much we can abuse Lucea's ability, so when we get to discussing the other cards in our deck, we can understand what they're truly capable of becoming. First up is Feto Alchemist, a 2-mana creature that can untap a creature or artifact. Most times we will use this on Lucea, but if we don't have her out, we can target another mana dork instead. Magerite Stone is a 2-mana artifact that also untaps any creature, but we have to pay 1 for its ability. Unlike Feto Alchemist, however, because it isn't a creature, it doesn't suffer from summoning sickness, so we can activate it right away. The fact we can also use the colorless mana from Lucea is also a welcome benefit. Quirion Ranger is a 1-mana creature that we can use to untap Lucea right away by returning a forest to our hand. This deck is capable of generating mana very quickly, especially considering we have a big mana dork in the command zone, so bouncing 1 to 2 land shouldn't hurt our game plan at all. Retreat to Coralhelm is a 3-mana enchantment that allows us to either tap or untap a creature, or scry 1 each time a land ETBs under our control. Most often we will be using this on Lucea, but the added utility of being able to filter our draws or hold up a fetch land if a Voltron commander is coming our way is very useful. Speaking of fetch lands, being able to untap Lucea twice using them is the main reason we are running as many as we viably can in this list. Sareth, the Viper's Fang, is a 4-mana creature that, like Retreat to Coralhelm, allows us to untap our commander while also offering additional utility. Giving Lucea another important creature's hexproof goes a long way towards protecting our board from spot removal, and is why this more uncostly untap effect has been included. Shore Up is a 1-mana cheap, instant speed untap effect that also provides protection in the form of hexproof. Thousand Year Elixir is a 3-mana artifact that not only untaps Lucea at the cost of 1 mana, but also gives all our creatures with activated abilities haste. This means any mana dorks we can cast refund their mana straight away, and we will also make recasting and using Lucea much easier. Vitalize is a 1-mana instant that untaps all creatures we control. So not only can we use this on Lucea for extra copies of our spells and abilities, but we can also use it as a neat combat trick by untapping our creatures when an opponent swings in thinking the coast is clear. Our last untap effect is Intruder Alarm, a 3-mana enchantment that says, creatures don't untap during their controller's untap steps, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield, untap all creatures. A dangerous card that can certainly backfire on us if not cast at the right time, but if we do, this can cause a game-ending spell to resolve due to the number of times we could potentially untap and tap Lucea. Altered Ego is a 4-mana creature with X that can't be countered and comes in as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it enters with X additional +1/+1 counters. Clone effects in our deck will be situational because we don't plan on copying our own creatures with them, but because we can copy 2 to 3 of the best creatures on board and it can't be countered, the floor is far higher than it otherwise would be. Exponential Growth is a 2-mana XX spell that can double a creature's power X times until end of turn. As you'll see later, a good number of our big hitters either have flying or trample, meaning that this spell can potentially take out 1 to 2 players with enough untap effects on board. As an example, if we have an 8/8 with Trample out and we cast Exponential Growth on it for x equals 2 just copied once, our 8 powered creature will now have 128 power, more than enough to get the job done on one opponent. Lightning Greaves is a 2-mana artifact that gives a creature haste and shroud when equipped. Lucea has a tap ability we always want to use as soon as possible, and because of how powerful her ability is, she will be a target. Greaves goes a long way towards letting her use it right away while also protecting her. Reap the Past and Wildest Dreams are both 2-mana XX spells that return X cards to our hand, ensuring recursion of our most powerful spells is always an option for us. Rhythm of the Wild and Temur Ascendancy both provide haste for our creatures, reducing the opportunities our opponents have to interact with our cards before they have an effect. They also provide additional utility, Rhythm ensuring our creatures can't be countered, and Ascendancy drawing us cards when our big creatures hit the board. Both abilities will be important in the games they make an appearance. Tyrant Guard is a 3-mana and X creature that has Ravenous and says, sacrifice Tyrant Guard, creatures you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So Tyrant provides our board with protection from most forms of removal, comes in as a big beater itself, and also draws us a card for each copy we make. Once this resolves, your opponents will have a hard time breaking through your value engine, especially if you have made multiple copies of it. Our last utility card is Unbound Flourishing, a 3-mana enchantment that doubles the value of X for our spells and activated abilities. Oftentimes, just getting multiple taps with Lucea is good enough to break open our spells, but having this enchantment as redundancy in case she gets removed too many times is always good to have. If you do manage to keep this and Lucea out, well, your opponents are going to be in a lot of trouble. And that covers our utility cards. Now we know just how much we can squeeze out of our X spells, let's begin by looking at our card advantage package. Our first card to discuss is Drowning Dreams, a 3-mana and X instant that says, choose one. If you control a commander as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Target player draws X cards, or target player mills twice X cards. Many times the ability to mill ourselves won't matter because we only run a small recursion package, and we certainly don't want to do our opponents any favors by milling them unless we can mill their entire deck. So this will largely act as an instant speed mass draw spell that has low colored pip requirements, a welcome sight in a 3-color deck. Finale of Revelation is a 2-mana and X sorcery that says, draw X cards. If X is 10 or more, instead shuffle your graveyard into your library, draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game, exile Finale of Revelation. So normally casting massive draw spells at sorcery speed is a bad idea because you often have little mana to use the cards you drew. But with Finale, if we can get X to equal 10, not only do we get to hold on to all the cards we draw with our no maximum hand size, but we can use some of them thanks to the untap effect. These effects combined make this a powerful spell to resolve on our turn and will often put us in a dominant position. Hydroid Krasis is a 2-mana and X creature with flying and trample that gains us half X life and draws us X cards rounded down. Similar to other cards mentioned and many to come, this serves multiple roles by drawing us cards, gaining life, and providing bodies to hit our opponents with. At the casual power level, life gain often becomes important when the game goes long, so seeing it attached to other important effects is something we are always happy to see. Lifeblood Hydra is a 3-mana and X creature with trample that gains us life and draws us cards based on its power when it dies. Although we can't access the card draw aspect freely, being able to resolve a big threat and having your opponent second guessing whether they should kill it has a power of its own. In some cases, if we focus the control player enough with damage, they'll be forced to remove it. Either way, it's a win-win for us. Multiple Choice is a 1-mana and X sorcery that says, if X is 1, scry 1 then draw a card. If X is 2, you may choose a player. They return a creature they control to its owner's hand. If X is 3, create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. If X is 4 or more, do all of the above. While not as powerful with regard to raw draw power like our other card advantage pieces, the utility this offers to bounce creatures and create bodies to attack or block with more than makes up for this. Pull from Tomorrow is a 2-mana and X instant that lets us draw X cards then discard a card. Another mass draw spell that gives us a little bit more selection at the cost of a single card, which is hardly a downside considering with mass draw spells we'll likely have lands we can't use anyway. Stroke of Genius is an instant similar to Pull from Tomorrow, except you keep all the cards you draw at the cost of 1 extra mana. Thassa's Intervention is a 2-mana and X instant that gives us 2 options. We can either look at the top X cards of our library and put up to 2 of them into our hand, or we can counter a spell unless its controller pays twice X. When we have a strong board established and we think we can end it with combat damage alone, being able to not only hold up a counter spell, but know it will resolve because we can make multiple copies of it is a good feeling. but if we aren't at that point yet, or no one interacts with us before our turn, we can use it to draw more cards and specifically filter to the draws we need. Last up is Silver Scrutiny, a 2 mana and X sorcery that says, you may cast Silver Scrutiny as though it had flash if X is 3 or less. Draw X cards. Casting this for only 3 into the X will still draw us a lot of cards if it's copied 2 or more times, but in the rarer moments where we have all the mana we need but not all the cards to go with it, we can dump mana into X at sorcery speed. And that covers our card advantage cards. But to get that X number high enough, we're going to need a lot of mana to go with it. So let's look at the cards that are going to help accelerate our mana and make X big. Arcane Signet, Biophagus, Birds of Paradise, Farseek, Elysian Caryatid, Nature's Law and 3 Visits are all 2 mana accelerants there to fix our colours as well as curve nicely into our 4 mana commander. Bloom Tender is a 2 mana creature that for each colour among permanents we control adds 1 mana of that colour to our mana pool. Casting this turn 2 and our commander turn 3 means that it can tap for 3 mana on turn 4, which, if we haven't missed a land drop and include our commander, gives us access to 9 total mana. This will allow some powerful plays if our opponents let this occur. Incubation Druid is another 2 mana creature that can produce 1 mana of any colour a land we control could produce. However, if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, it adds 3 mana instead. Lucea's first ability to put a counter on a creature means if we turn 2 Druid and turn 3 Lucea, in our second main phase of turn 3, Druid will tap for 3 mana, allowing us to cast more mana dorks or utility pieces to set up for next turn. Sanctum Weaver is also a 2 mana dork, but taps for X mana of any colour, where X is the amount of enchantments we control. Often this will just tap for 1, but having that 1 be any colour with the option to tap for more if we land one of our enchantments makes it worth including. Kiora's Follower, Clever Conjurer, Kelpie Guide, and Vizier of the Tumbling Sands are creatures that can tap to untap any permanent. So before we have Lucea out, they can act as simple mana dorks with upside if we have another permanent that produces more than 1 mana, for example Bloom Tender. But when Lucea is out, they act as an untap effect to build her triggered ability up. Either way, having mana dorks that can also act as untappers are exactly what this deck wants to make the most of our commander's ability. Kiora Behemoth Beckoner is a 3 mana planeswalker that can untap permanents, but also provides card draw for when our bigger creatures ETB. Card draw and mana acceleration attached to 1 card is something we'll never turn down at this cost. Patriarch's Seal is a 3 mana artifact that can not only produce 1 mana of any colour, but also untaps legendary creatures. By now, with all the untap effects you've seen us run, you can understand how it won't be hard to trigger Lucea's ability at least 2 to 3 times, even in the early game. Our last mana accelerant is Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, a 3 mana creature that we can pay 1 green into to tap for X mana in any combination of colours, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. With the big creatures we plan on dropping, many you'll see discussed soon, it won't be hard for Selvala to tap for a lot of mana when we hit the mid game. Not only this, but she also provides us card draw if we end up putting the biggest creatures into play, which most often will be a safe bet. Like our Planeswalker Kiora, Selvala provides 2 effects we love to see on 1 card. And that covers all our mana accelerants. Now, while drawing a lot of cards and making a lot of mana is always a good thing, we still need ways to interact with our opponents in case they present a lethal board state before we do. So let's look at our interactive package. Aberrant is a 2 mana and X creature that has Ravenous and Trample, and when it deals combat damage to a player, we can destroy an artifact or enchantment that player controls. There will always be problematic artifacts and enchantments we need to remove, but being able to potentially do so turn after turn is a powerful ability to have access to. The fact it also draws a card for each copy we make ensures our hand never gets too low. Crackle with Power is a 2 mana and XXX spell that says, Crackle with Power deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. With our commander and only 5 mana, this will often remove multiple creatures or planeswalkers, but with a good amount of mana and untap effects, this can easily end the game on its own. Deflecting Swat and Fierce Guardianship are 3 mana instants included largely to protect our commander who will be a large target at the table. The power of our X spells comes from them being copied, so keeping our commander on board is paramount if we are to keep the pressure up on our opponents. Speaking of decks relying on their commanders, Dominate is a 3 mana and X instant that allows us to steal a creature with mana value X or less. If we come up against commander-centric decks like our own, being able to steal their commanders can largely shut down their game plans and give us less opponents to worry about. When we aren't stealing commanders, we are almost guaranteed our opponents can provide us with some powerful creatures that we can use against them. Heroic Intervention is a 2 mana instant that can give our permanents hexproof and indestructible. When our plan largely revolves around closing out the game with big beaters, being able to protect them from board wipes is paramount, especially against control-heavy decks. Clouth's Will is a 3 mana and next instant that says, choose one. If you control a commander as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Clouth's Will deals X damage to each creature without flying, or destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments. The first mode is something we won't use that often unless things are getting dire and we have to hit the emergency button. But the second mode will help us to easily clear the board of all our opponent's artifacts and enchantments, and making multiple copies means it will be harder to counter too. March of Swirling Mist is a 1 mana and X instant that allows us to phase out X target creatures. A flexible spell we can use offensively and defensively. If we need to get attackers through, we can cast this on blockers and essentially make our creatures unblockable. But if an opponent is going off or attempts to wipe the board, we can also phase out the appropriate creatures. March should be useful at almost all points in the game. Morlock is a 2 mana and X creature that has Ravenous and fights a creature an opponent controls on ETB, exiling it if it dies. This is powerful removal in this deck because we can remove multiple creatures, we exile the creatures when they die, and we also draw cards to refill our hand. If that wasn't enough, we also get some big bodies left over to attack and defend with. Pest Infestation is a 1 mana and XX spell that says, destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments. Create twice X 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So this not only removes our opponent's artifacts and enchantments in mass, but it also leaves us with a small army of bodies that can chump block and gain us life when they die. This will be a welcome sight as our opponents will likely be swinging our way once we clear the board of their stuff. Primal Might is a 1 mana and X sorcery that can give a creature we control +X until end of turn. Then it fights up to 1 target creature we don't control. An interactive spell for creatures that can also potentially help us land big damage on our opponents. What more could you ask for in a big creature deck like this looking to be aggressive? Steelbane Hydra is a 2 mana and X creature that we can pay 3 mana into and remove a counter to destroy an artifact or enchantment. While this rate may seem a little costly for the effect, having it come in attached to multiple bodies that are difficult to interact with once it's on board makes the cost worth it. Voracious Hydra is a 2 mana and X creature with trample that says, when Voracious Hydra ETBs, choose one. Double the number of +1/+1 counters on Voracious Hydra, or Voracious Hydra fights target creature you don't control. So when our opponent's creatures are becoming a problem, we choose the fight mode to clear the board somewhat. But when we feel having some big tramplers on board is enough to get the job done, we can elect for the other option. Once again, having choices here gives our deck flexibility based on what we need at the time. Our last interactive card is Zoanthrope, a 2 mana and X creature with Ravenous, Flying and Ward 2 and says, when Zoanthrope ETBs, it deals X damage to any target. Another removal piece for creatures and planeswalkers that not only has evasion and draws us cards, but also protects itself as well. Because of these abilities, this is one of our more threatening interactive pieces that serves us well long after its ETB effect is done. And that's all our interactive cards. Now the next set of cards we're going to look at is something that I've affectionately termed our big beater cards. They're there to do just that, be big and beat hard. First up is Broodlord, a 4 mana and X creature that has Ravenous and distributes X +1/+1 counters among any number of other creatures we control when it ETBs. So when each Broodlord comes in, it helps to buff our other creatures. With Lucea and multiple copies ETBing, we should be left with some big boys on the table. Neverwinter Hydra is a 2 mana and XX creature with trample and ward 4 that says, as Neverwinter Hydra ETBs, roll XD6. It enters with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the total of those results. Another big beater that has some random chance thrown in for how big it gets. What's really great about this one is the evasion and protection it has in the form of trample and ward 4 respectively. This means once it lands, it will be hard to remove, especially with multiple copies on board, and it shouldn't struggle getting damage through. Primordial Hydra is a 2 mana and X creature that doubles its +1/+1 counters each upkeep and gets trample if it has 10 or more +1/+1 counters on it. A big beater in its purest form that grows larger and larger each turn cycle. A few copies of this on board can end a game fast if they aren't dealt with. Stonecoil Serpent is a creature that costs X and has reach, trample, and protection from multicolored. While not as big as its counterparts, being able to block flyers and having multicolor protection will be relevant more times than you think. Our last big beater is more like a big spreader, and that card is Turvagon, a 2 mana creature with X and Ravenous and Trample. It says, whenever Turvagon deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green Tyranid creature tokens. So when it enters, it will likely be a decent size and it will also draw us cards. But when it connects, it will start to flood the board with small creatures that will quickly get out of hand, especially if we are attacking the deck that runs a low amount of creatures to block with. Why just go big when you can go wide as well? And that covers our big beaters. Now let's move on to any lands that are vital for our game plan. Cavern of Souls ensures our commander can't be countered, which is needed in a deck so reliant on its commander. The fact we run a good number of Tyranids also means it synergizes well with many other cards in our deck. Kessig Wolfrun is an overrun effect on a land which we can trigger multiple times thanks to Lucea. While most of our creatures are big already, sometimes that extra power and trample is needed to get the job done. Manamo, School at Water's Edge, is an untap effect on a land, but only for legendary creatures. The more untap effects we can squeeze in without taking up non-land slots, the better. Finally, Shatterskull Smashing gives us creature removal that can hit quite a number of creatures depending on how many times we copy it. Interaction that comes attached to a land we can play untapped and synergizes with our commander is always welcome in this list. And that covers all our notable lands. Now unfortunately Lucea isn't available on Magic Online at the moment, so I won't be able to create some gameplay videos so you can see how the deck performs in action. But instead, I thought we might look at least how the deck mulligans up to turn 5 so you can get a feel for how the deck plays out, at least in the early game. Alright, so let's begin. We'll shuffle our hand up. Alright, so if we look at our first opening hand, we have 2 lands, we have turn 2 ramp, that's what we always like to see in this deck so we can keep it. We'll draw our first card for turn. We get a fetch land, so what we'll do is we'll play that fetch land, we'll crack it, we'll go find our Triome, we'll put it into play tapped, we'll shuffle our library. Now we'll go to our second turn. We'll play our Stomping Ground untapped, we'll lose 2 life. Then we'll cast our Bloom Tender. Now we'll move to our next turn. We draw another land for turn, so we'll just play one of our fetch lands, we'll crack it. We'll put an island into play. Then we'll shuffle. Now on turn 3, we'll get Lucea out. We'll move to combat. We'll put a counter onto her. And now let's go to turn 4. Okay, so on turn 4, we have access to quite a few options here. We have Protection, which is really nice. Shore Up is an untap effect. So let's actually see what we can do here. We do have the choice. We could actually draw some cards with Drown to Dream, so we could pass the turn here and have a massive draw step if we'd like. We also have a big body here in the form of Tyrant Guard, which is going to protect our board. So I think we'll actually try to get down a big body here and see what we can do. So we'll tap Lucea down for 2 colorless mana. We'll tap for a blue, we'll use Shore Up targeting Lucea, so that will untap her. We'll tap her down again. So that's going to give us 4 colorless mana and 2 activations, 2 delayed triggers. Now we'll tap out. So that'll be 4, 5, 6. And Bloom Tender is going to tap for 3 mana. So that'll take us to 9 mana. So we'll cast Tyrant Guard. X is going to be 6. Because we tapped Magus Lucea twice, that's going to make 2 copies. And so now on turn 4, we've just added 3 copies of a creature there that has 6/1/1 counters, so they're all 9/9s. And because they also have Ravenous, so X is 5 or more, we get to draw 3 cards from that. So as you can see, just on turn 4, we've established quite a threatening board state. We have some big beaters on board that are already going to get quite a lot of damage through because it's unlikely many of our opponents would have creatures out at the moment, or at least creatures are going to be able to trade with these ones. We have Protection, and if we untap next turn, we have access to more untap effects. We can draw some cards. We also have counter magic to protect our board. So this is just one demonstration of what the deck can potentially do. Let's try it one more time. So in our first hand, we have some lands. We have a turn 2 ramp, which is great to see. We have interaction and card draw, so we'll keep this hand straight away. We'll draw. We draw into some interaction, so we'll just play our Triome tapped. We'll move to turn 2. We draw Incubation Druid. I think we'll actually play the Druid here, so we play that. Turn 2, that comes down. We move to turn 3, we draw some counter magic. We'll play our island. We'll tap out for Magus Lucea Kane. Now we'll move to combat. We'll actually add the counter here to our Incubation Druid, so now it's going to be able to tap for 3 mana of any land that we control could produce. And now when we move to turn 4, we have Protection up, which is really nice to see because we're going to be casting some big spells here. So we'll play our Windswept Heath. We'll go find our Stomping Ground. So we have access to more red mana. We'll lose 2 life. Now we can tap Magus Lucea Kane down for 2 colorless. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And now when we cast our Lifeblood Hydra for X equals 6, we'll have made 2 copies of that. And so now we have 2 6/6 tramplers on board that if the board does actually get wiped, it's going to allow us to draw 12 cards, which is definitely going to make life a lot easier in rebuilding. And that's the deck in action. Now, normally this is where I'd go on to discuss any spicy synergies or powerful plays the deck is capable of, but truth be told, you've already seen many of them. Lucea is fairly simple in her game plan. Resolve Lucea, tap and untap her as many times as you can, and then cast a big X spell copied multiple times. Now, don't get me wrong, you are going to feel great copying a big spell 3 to 4 times, but this doesn't involve any complicated plays or tricky lines. Lucea wants you to hit hard with value and keep hitting harder until your opponents are overwhelmed with that value. Does this mean the deck is too linear? I don't think so. We have enough spells with varied effects and multiple modalities that each game should feel different when you play it out. Remember, sometimes there is beauty in simplicity. But that is the deck. Magus Lucea Kane is the deck of big. Big values for X, big value in the multiple copies she makes, and big resilience in being able to work through counterspells and single target removal better than most decks. Like the Tyrannid she represents, her plan is simple yet very effective. So if you've been looking to run a deck that ramps hard, casts big spells you wouldn't normally run, and is resilient to interaction, then this is the deck for you. Well, that's it from me today. If this list looks like something you'd like to build and play, then proxy it up, make any personal touches you feel it needs, and then try it out. And when you do, make sure to drop us a line and let us know how it went. But until then, take care guys.